All right, well, it's great to see all of you here. Hey, Doug and his staff have done a great job once again. I mean, kudos to the Water Congress. Please give them a hand. Way to go, Doug. Way to go, Water Congress staff. I'm Reagan Wascom. I direct the Water Center at Colorado State University, and really pleased now to get to talk about my favorite subject, food and agriculture, right? That's what we're here to discuss in the next hour and 15 minutes. We've got a great panel. Doug gave the panel the title of Keeping Agriculture Profitable. I've had several people point out the irony in that title right now. Interesting times for agriculture, aren't they? 2018 drought, pretty tough. And the little bit of the state that wasn't in hard drought had inordinate amount of hail this year. That was crazy as well, but you pair that with low commodity prices, high input prices, market uncertainties, regulations, labor shortage. There's some pretty serious headwinds out there for agriculture, and then you put water transfer and just the difficulty of keeping water in agriculture on top of that, and we do have some interesting things to talk about in terms of keeping ag profitable. And one of the things we hear from producers often is the best way to keep water in agriculture is to keep agriculture profitable and working on the land. So we're going to talk about that. We've got a great panel this morning. We're going to start with Dan Keppen with the Family Farm Alliance, then he's going to bring up Pat O'Toole. We're going to Dan will keynote us, and then we'll have sort of like a panel. We'll have three folks. Secretary Vilsack will come up after Pat, then we'll have Commissioner Greenberg, and then the five of us will have some dialogue up here, and we'll see if we can mix it up and have a good time. So with that, I want to introduce Dan Keppen. I think many of you know Dan. I believe, Dan, you've spoken to the Water Congress before. He's the executive director of the Family Farm Alliance, which you all know is dedicated to Western irrigated agriculture. That's what they work on night and day at the federal and state level. Dan's an engineer by training, and he hails from Klamath Falls, Oregon. So let's give Dan a Colorado welcome, please.
You gotta hear the song a little bit. Yeah, Metallica. Probably the best introduction I've ever had. So Metallica is like that band AC/DC. They have 30 albums. They probably all sound the same. They're all awesome as far as I'm concerned. I've actually seen Metallica a couple times. Great to be here. I'm really impressed with the audience. This has got to be the largest Congress meeting I've been to, so really nice to see the enthusiasm. I always love coming to Colorado, so I travel all over the West and in D.C. as well. But so I'm pretty familiar with all 17 Western states. I worked most of my career in California and in the Klamath Basin, which is kind of the poster child for water conflict. And you had some visionary people in this state that put some things together that have kept you out of some of the situations that we're facing on the West Coast right now. In particular, those recovery plans on the Colorado River, that was visionary, I have to say. So I'm listed as a keynote. I'm not quite sure why. When you look at the folks that are following me, they're much more qualified, I feel. So it's a real honor to be here. As Reagan said, Pat O'Toole is going to speak after I give sort of an overview of some of the things we've been doing at the Alliance. And then we're honored to have Secretary Vilsack here to introduce the new Colorado Ag Commissioner. And I'd like to just say a few comments before I get into my presentation about Kate Greenberg. She's a personal friend. We randomly ran into each other at a reclamation watershed study that was going on in the Obama administration. We had a meeting at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. Our flights got canceled, and that's kind of how we met. We were trying to figure out what to do, and we started talking. And she had just started at the Young Farmers, National Young Farmers Coalition. I had been at the Family Farm Alliance for 5 or 6 years, and we just realized we had a lot of common interests. And that led to a couple of partnership things that we did. We put together a case study, a report that was funded by the Walton Family Foundation, intended to highlight how folks in the Colorado River Basin and one case study in California are doing constructive things with water conservation and soil health. And then Kate also put together a tour of the Durango area that brought together members of her organization and the Family Farm Alliance. Our members in general are family operations, but pretty traditional big producers. Kate's organization has obviously younger farmers. Some of them are big producers, and some of them are smaller and kind of focused on local markets. And I was kind of interested to see what the dynamic was going to be getting those people together, because sometimes agriculture, we eat our own when it comes to commodity differences and things like that. It was really gratifying to see the older, I should say the seasoned farmers and ranchers talking to the younger folks and how they were both kind of learning from each other. I have to commend the governor of Colorado for picking Kate, because right now I believe 8% of farmers and ranchers in this country are 35 years or younger. Kate runs an organization that is the future of agriculture, and she's young and energetic, and I'm looking forward to working with her, and I think the governor made a really good call there. So, on to my presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about background of Family Farm Alliance and what we do. All our mission statement is about is protecting and enhancing water supplies for irrigated agriculture in the 17 western states. So if you look at Jim Augsbury's map that he put up earlier, that everything west of the 100th meridian, that's our membership, and it's ag focused. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened in the last 2 years with the 115th Congress, with the first 2 years of the Trump administration, with a focus on water infrastructure, the Farm Bill, which was just signed into law in December, and then talk a little bit about the Trump rulemaking, which was fast and furious, and in my view, beneficial to our industry in the last 2 years. And then with some emphasis on the Clean Water Rule, which was talked about on the previous panel, and the efforts of the Trump administration to replace that with a new rule. And then they've asked me to talk about Colorado River Basin drought contingency plans. I'm going to very generally talk about it and just try to give you a sense of how complicated that issue is based on our membership, which spans all 7 states of the Colorado River Basin. And then we'll turn it over to the real stars of the show. So as I said, Family Farm Alliance we're a nonprofit organization set up about 25 years ago. And it was set up because at the time Congressman George Miller from the East Bay in California was putting together the Reclamation Reform Act, and some of our California growers were at a social function saying, boy, wouldn't it be nice if there was an organization that could get folks from the ground face to face with their congressional people or the staff or the agency folks in downtown DC. And that program became a cornerstone of the Family Farm Alliance, which is our farmer lobby program, which we do once or twice a year. And we're actually an Arizona corporation. The organization started out with Central Valley and Arizona growers, and now it's expanded to include members in all 17 western states. The so-called reclamation states, we do a lot of partnership work with the Bureau of Reclamation. We have a board of directors of, you have to be a landowner, have to be a rancher, an operating rancher or farmer. Pat O'Toole, who will be following me today, is president of Family Farm Alliance. He's a rancher right on the Wyoming-Colorado border. I think his driveway is the state border, actually. Don Schwent from Cortez is a Colorado representative on our board. And then we have an advisory committee membership that consists of about 45 water professionals. So it's irrigation district managers, attorneys, economists, association managers from all over the place. It's a really important part of our organization. And in Colorado, the folks on our advisory committee include Ken Curtis, Bruce Whitehead, Brad Wynn from Northern, Jim Broderick, and Chris Treese. So it's a good group of folks. And we have a pretty good rep in DC, and I think it's because we have a very active board and a very active advisory committee. So we'll get calls from committee staff or from agency staff saying, hey, we're thinking about this sort of a policy, or Congressman Smith has introduced this bill, what's your take on it? And we can get it out to this advisory committee, and usually within 24 hours, it's ground truth, and we can get back to the folks in DC with a pretty detailed memo giving them some insight on that. We do that with both parties. And I think because of that, we've got credibility, and it's evidenced by the fact that we've been asked since 2005 70 times to testify before Congress. And the issues that we have been focusing on in recent years are Western drought legislation, which has kind of morphed into some of the things that were in the last WRDA bill. The drought, 2 years ago, California got hammered with a snowstorm about this time of year, and all of a sudden people stopped talking about the drought there. You're obviously still in a drought in the Colorado River Basin. We spent a lot of time just trying to stay on top of all the regulations that are out there. So we testify on that. We have these 40-year-old federal laws like the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act and NEPA, all well-intentioned, but they're 40 years old. And we're constantly looking for ways to try to modernize that or change the implementation of that so that they work better, especially as far as recovering species. If a fish species is listed and it's impacting your water project, the quicker that fish species is taken off the list, the better everybody is. And so we're always looking for those sort of approaches to find more constructive approaches and solutions to these laws instead of relying on litigation. And then we're all about water infrastructure. It's a big challenge in the West, especially with the Bureau of Reclamation. It's got projects that are decades old. Where I live in the Klamath Basin, our project is well over 100 years old. It's one of the 3 oldest reclamation projects in the country. And we just don't have the funding mechanisms that we used to take care of those. So we got to come up with some innovative funding solutions. And another approach to take, knowing that you don't have the federal dollars there anymore, is trying to find ways to cut through the regulatory process associated with permitting. And it's not just dams or canals. Even the conservation groups will kind of gripe about how tough it is just to get the permitting done for a restoration project. It takes way too long. And it's very uncertain, especially if you're trying to do a water infrastructure project. So we're always looking for ways to try to improve the coordination and streamline the regulatory process. And so with that said, that probably gives you a sense of why we were kind of encouraged by what's happened in the last 2 years coming out of the Department of Interior and the administration. We're also, we work with a variety of different coalitions. And I'll talk about the one that's featured here shortly. But we've been invited to participate in the charting new waters that the Johnson Foundation did about 5 to 10 years ago. Pat O'Toole is on the AGREE Advisory Committee. AGREE is sort of a coalition of a bunch of huge funders that are really looking at the big picture ag challenges in the world. Pat also sits on the board of the Solutions for the Land and the IWJV, which is the Intermountain West Joint Venture, which does a lot of great work involving irrigated ranch land and waterfowl habitat. All these logos I'm showing you are organizations, and it's a partial demonstration there, of a very loose group called the Western Ag and Conservation Coalition, and many of the folks involved with that coalition are in the room here today. It kind of started out in a Colorado River Basin, with a Colorado River Basin focus. This is a group that was set up to focus on coming up with conservation title programs in the Farm Bill that benefited farmers, but also provided opportunities to fund environmental fixes. And that group was formed probably almost 15 years ago, and it actually had an impact. It led to the creation of a program called AWEP, which is included in the conservation title. And the whole idea behind AWEP was to provide sort of like an EQIP type of a program. EQIP is a USDA program that's intended to improve on-farm efficiencies of water use. AWEP is intended to allow larger entities to do that and coordinate with multiple landowners so you get a better bang for the buck and it can be done more efficiently. That ultimately got morphed into RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And in this last Farm Bill, some changes were made as well. But focusing on that small area of agreement really worked. And we've been together now for almost a decade. The WAC, it's probably an unfortunate acronym, but the Western Ag and Conservation Coalition. It was Trout Unlimited and Family Farm Alliance, and actually with some support from the George W. Bush administration, really urging these folks to get together. And it's been effective. This last conservation title in the Farm Bill, the wax footprints or fingerprints were all over it. And we're going beyond just talking about Farm Bill now. We've developed policy paper where we've agreed on Endangered Species Act principles, which I would have never thought could happen. But that's what happens when you start developing trust on a small basis. And so this coalition, I think, is going to be very important in this coming Congress, where we can go back with our conservation allies to some of the committees and say, hey, there's opportunities to do things where farmers and conservation groups are working together that for purposes that are mutually beneficial. We don't need to get in a situation where we're constantly demonizing agriculture, which is what we see in the Central Valley and even where I live. Some outside groups will demonize agriculture. So just wanted to talk about that. It's a new approach, and Pat is going to talk about that further in his comments. Pat has a great vision as to how we tackle big picture climate change, ag production, helping critters as a sort of the new template for success in the West. So getting into the water and energy developments here recently. So when President Trump was elected, there was much made of a huge infrastructure package that was going to be rolled out. And it was rolled out. There was a lot of questions about how it was going to be financed. But I would have to say, other than the transportation part of it, administratively, there hasn't been a lot that's transpired yet. However, there's been tremendous progress made in the topic of interest to our organization, which is trying to find ways to streamline environmental review and permitting. And a lot has been done there right off the bat as soon as the president started in early 2017. So this is another thing, too, that I've never seen. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never really seen a president personally get engaged in our issues. And you know, I'll admit, it probably was done for political purposes. This picture here was taken in Arizona, in Scottsdale, just prior to the election. Those are 5 California Republicans that were up for election when this got rolled out. But this memo was important to our membership, especially the folks in California, and it directed the agencies to set timelines on reconsultation of biological opinions associated with the Central Valley Project, the Klamath Project, and the Columbia Basin Hydro Project up there in Washington and Oregon. And it also, you know, said it set up a sort of a game plan to coordinate and be accountable, and it set up a point person on dealing with the consultation between the fisheries agencies. That meant a lot to our folks, and I'm seeing it happen in Klamath right now, where we've got National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation working on reconsultation. When the president says it has to be done by this time, it was moving along quicker than we'd all anticipated before it started. Switching to Congress, I think a lot of the action in the last couple of years has been relative to the WIN Act, which was the previous Water Resources Development Act, which passed, I think, at the end of 2016. WRDA, as many of you know, is the vehicle that authorizes and funds primarily Corps of Engineers programs across the country, but more and more frequently it's being used as a vehicle to tack on other things, and in this case, specific provisions to deal with Bay Delta operations and infrastructure were put in there. So it benefits primarily California, and we saw a lot of progress from our organization on that in the last 2 years, primarily because we have a pretty large California membership. But elsewhere, we also got a new WRDA bill that was signed just a couple months ago, and it's pretty Corps of Engineers centric, like a traditional WRDA bill would be. There are provisions in there for the Klamath Project, water banking, and it allows movement of non-project water in project facilities. There's a WIFIA financing pilot program in there. And then from getting away from water supply and looking at flood control, there's a very strong Western flavor in the AWIA of 2018 on Missouri River and Snake River matters. Sediment control, those sort of things. And I think that's primarily due to the fact that Chairman Barrasso from the EPW committee sort of shepherded this bill. And so there's a good Western flavor in this. Another thing that personally I'm appreciative of is I used to run a flood control district in the Sacramento Valley, and when we were trying to compete for flood control dollars with, say, City of Sacramento or the urban municipalities in California, when you try to justify flood control protection in a rural area, it's pretty tough to do that with the current benefit cost criteria. This new bill actually gives more weight to those values that are important to rural communities. So that was another positive thing. We were really involved with this whole WRDA process. It started out really, some of the legislation they were looking at was leftover sort of drought legislation that Senator Flake was looking at. And then it morphed into these two committees putting together a bill in the Senate. We were asked several times to testify as this stuff was moving along. That's a picture of Pat O'Toole there testifying about a year ago before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Here's the other thing that happened that I think was pretty good was the Farm Bill. We weren't sure if it was going to make it over the finish line or not, but the positive parts of this Farm Bill are really the conservation title, and I think the conservation title is successful in large part because of the coalition that worked on it. It was a very good, loose coalition of conservation groups and farming groups from across the country. There's good funding in there for the RCPP and the EQIP program. For the first time ever, irrigation districts now are eligible to apply for EQIP dollars on behalf of their landowners, and that's something we've been pushing for a long time, again, just to make it more administratively quicker and more efficient and effective from the overall result that you see on the ground. There's a great program called PL 566. Has anybody utilized that in the past, 566? So it used to be sort of a standard thing that was funded every year back in the day in the 60s and the 70s, and then it kind of went away. This program is really flexible, and if you're an irrigation district or a local government entity, I suggest you take a look at it, because there's a lot of things you can do. You can build small dams with PL 566. Very flexible. And for the first time now, we've got mandatory funding for that. We were hoping for $100 million a year, but $50 million of mandatory funding got put in there. That's a win. And then throughout the bill, there's all kinds of provisions for beginning farmers and ranchers. And I got to thank Kate's organization, the National Young Farmers Coalition. A lot of their ideas got sprinkled throughout the Farm Bill that give preferences to young farmers and ranchers throughout the country. A couple other things I'll just mention that are in there, and I had a conversation in the hallway about this, that relate to the DCP. There's provisions in there right now that allow states to apply for some of these conservation dollars. And I think there's there's talk about California perhaps applying for $200 million to do salt and sea restoration as part of Imperial Irrigation District's DCP commitment. We'll see where that goes. It's going to be kind of political hot potato. And then there's also, for the first time, EQIP can fund deficit irrigation. And that might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. Depends on how you view it, but that's in there, and I'm sure some people are eyeing that as a tool to help with Colorado DCP demand management funding. Oops, sorry about that. The biggest disappointment in the Farm Bill, and we really just focus on the conservation title, the young farmer rancher provisions, and then the forestry title. I think many of us in the West particularly were just blown away that the House provisions for the forestry title weren't included in the final bill. It was actually pilot programs for the most part, but it would have provided sort of NEPA streamline to go in and do some thinning and salvage and start cleaning out the forests. I've heard stories about, from Pat O'Toole about the conditions of the forest here in Colorado in some areas. Where I live in Oregon, it's the same way. We got these stands of beetle kill that are out there. They can't even go in there and clean them out. 5 weeks in the Klamath Basin this summer, we had air visibility about 1.5 miles, and we didn't even have fires in our basin. It was from all the smoke, the Carr fire in Redding, the big fire in Paradise, all that smoke came into our basin. We had air quality that was the worst in the world, like 3 days in that period. And all this is going on. People's lives and property are communities being devastated, and the Farm Bill is being negotiated, and we couldn't get these provisions, these simple provisions, just to do some pilot projects. Very disappointing. So I know a lot of people in my state are pretty fired up about that, and hopefully there will be another vehicle to start moving in a direction where we can kind of actively manage these forests. Our annual conference is coming up in about 3 weeks in Reno, and we got a panel coming in. Jim Hubbard, who's an undersecretary at USDA, is one of our invited guests. Hopefully the government isn't shut down. And we're going to talk about how active management with empirical evidence can actively improve the watershed yield for a lot of these watersheds in the West. And that's a tool I think people got to be looking at too when you're looking at demand management or however you want to fill up that reservoir space in Powell. Long-term forest management could help contribute and increase some of these yields. So now we're into the 116th Congress. The day after the election, I had to speak at an NWA event in San Diego, and they wanted to, bring out the crystal ball and predict what was going to happen in the next Congress. So I had about 3 hours to figure that out. So I'm calling lobbyists and congressional staffers all over the place, and it kind of came down to this. I think, what's going to happen in the House with the House under the control of Democrats right now? It's not going to be as easy for the Trump administration to get a lot of things done. But is this going to be a series of investigations, or are we going to actually legislate? That's the big question right now. Honestly, the day after the election, the 2020 presidential campaign began, and you're seeing it right now with all the maneuvering that's going on in D.C. But one area where there's some common ground, I think, is infrastructure. And right now, the new chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is Peter DeFazio from my home state, Oregon, who's a good guy and who appreciates agriculture. They've got a pretty aggressive agenda to go after infrastructure. So what I'm hearing right now is there'll probably be a two-phase approach here in this Congress in the next several months. A package will be put together to deal with like broadband and probably water, those sort of things. A bigger transportation package will be done when they have to reauthorize the big national transportation bill in 2020. But there's going to be opportunities, and even Nancy Pelosi, the day after the election, said, we are for bigger paychecks by building the infrastructure of America, and we are far better government by reducing the role of money in politics. One of my themes is build, build, build. And so maybe there's some sort of a deal that could be done there. The big question is how many dollars is it going to cost, and how are we going to fund it? But there's opportunities out there right now, and so we're working with our friends in the conservation community to put together letters on things that we can all agree on. I'm working right now with Western Growers and the Farm Bureau on a letter that we're going to get out to a lot of our ag folks, urging that they write letters with a wish list of things that would be very similar to the things we're asking for in the drought a couple years ago. So regulatory reform, there was all kinds of things done in the last Congress towards that end. Right off the bat, the Congressional Review Act was used to overturn 14 Obama regulations shortly after President Trump took office. The committees had all kinds of oversight hearings on Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act throughout the Congress. A lot of bills were introduced, a lot of votes occurred, but the bottom line, Congress really didn't overturn any of these major federal environmental laws in the last Congress. I will say, let me go back real quick. Jim Ogsbury earlier talked about the Western Governors ESA initiative that was launched by Governor Meade in Wyoming. We were very involved in that process, and one of the things that came out of it is Senator Barrasso from Wyoming put forth a draft discussion bill that attempted to capture what the Western Governors had put together. The Western Governors' recommendations were really focused on trying to give the states a bigger role and encouraging actions to prevent listing of species, that sort of thing, kind of low-hanging fruit. The bill got introduced, and I should say the draft bill got introduced, and then Senator Barrasso brought in some working groups to try to figure out if there's some agreement on the low-hanging fruit. Senator Barrasso has told us that ESA will be one of his top 2 priorities in this Congress, which is, that's encouraging to see. I think there's a chance for agreement there, but I don't know if it's going to happen in this Congress or not. But it's nice to know that he's continuing not just to take that Western Governor's report and put it on the shelf. He's trying to make it happen, and that's really encouraging. So that's probably the best thing that I saw come out of the Congress was sort of really conservation groups, ag groups, urban groups, developers, sitting down together with Senator Barrasso's people to see if there's areas of agreement on this discussion draft. So we'll see what comes out of that. Administratively, it's just been a flood of change. Right off the bat, in February 2017, the President issued an executive order to alleviate unnecessary regulatory burdens placed on the American people. The agencies went out and actively solicited comments from folks, and we took advantage of that and sent detailed comments to all these agencies: EPA, NOAA Fisheries, Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, USDA, who all have jurisdiction and activities going on in the West. And then when the administration first came in with the transition team, we put together about a 75-page report that had detailed recommendations of things that we wanted to see done. And I look back now, I use that as my checklist. I'm not saying our organization had influence there, but when I looked at the things that are being done, the folks that are at Interior in particular right now, and some of the folks that are at EPA, kind of think like our leadership thinks. And so I look at that list that we submitted of things for the agencies, and I can check them off. I mean, there's being progress made on several of those. So that, from our standpoint, that's encouraging. I think the people at the Department of Interior right now and Reclamation think like a lot of our members do. And then on the streamlined regulation front, CEQ issued an advance notice for an update of NEPA. Lots of folks weighed in with that. Basically what they did is they asked a lot of questions, and I think they're going to weigh and figure out how they're going to proceed from there. Probably the most important ESA effort I've seen within Congress or the administration has been Interior Department's rulemaking on procedures for listing and recovering and designating critical habitat, protective regulations, and streamlining interagency consultations. The interagency consultations is a big deal, especially when you have anadromous fish, like on the West Coast, where you have National Marine Fisheries Service with jurisdiction over anadromous fish, and you have Fish and Wildlife Service with jurisdiction over another fish. The biological opinions sometimes compete with each other, and it puts water users at a disadvantage. So this process that the Interior put forth was pretty encouraging. My understanding was they were supposed to finish and finalize the rule before Christmas. Then the government shutdown happened, and I called specifically to find out where they're at on this before my presentation, and kind of radio silence. I think David Bernhardt, the Deputy Secretary of Interior, who's now the acting Secretary of Interior, has been the point person along with Todd Willems. Todd Willems is now his Chief of Staff, so I think that might be the reason why we're not seeing real progress on that recently. But it's very encouraging, and from my standpoint, the environmental baseline discussion that's in this document, it could be a game changer for some water projects in the West. And then to get to the topic of a little bit more detail that Reagan asked me to talk about was the Waters of the U.S. and the two-step process that the Trump administration is using to sort of replace the Obama Clean Water Rule with a new rule. And you'll recall that a lot of the ag organizations during the presidential campaign made a big deal about the overreach, the perceived overreach of the Obama Waters of the U.S. rule. And I'd have to say some of that might have been a little overblown, I'll admit that. But definitely there's risk. There's risk associated with the jurisdictional expansion under the Obama rule for our members. So there was supposed to be a new rule proposed. As was mentioned earlier, it's been postponed because the government shut down. They were going to have a big sort of a teleconference webinar between EPA and the Corps this month. That got postponed. But the whole idea is to provide a clear, understandable, and implementable definition of waters of the U.S. That sort of clarifies when the feds can apply their jurisdiction. There's been some pretty good progress made as far as the ditches go. So our focus with the Obama administration on the rule was really making sure that current protections and clarity relative to irrigation ditches and canals were kept in place. And specifically, there's a regulatory guidance letter called RGL 0702, which was put together by the Bush administration. And it provides clarity and assurances for folks that operate irrigation districts and canals and ditches as to, you can go in there and do maintenance and that sort of thing and not have to worry about getting a permit or getting sued. Our biggest concern for our membership was ensuring that that stayed in place. And I have to say, we worked with the highest level folks at EPA and the Corps in the Obama administration who actually put a letter together and said, you know, regardless of what happens with this rule, that letter's gonna hold. So that's a big victory for all of you. We just want to make sure that that letter stays in place with this whole rulemaking process, and if possible, maybe even gets written into the rule itself so it's a little stronger. So that's really been the focus of our efforts. We have a group set up that consists of attorneys and water managers from all over the West that's looking at this new proposed rule, and we'll issue comments to the administration on that in the coming months once the process gets going again. And in the meantime, it's a mess. You know, some states, the Obama-era rule is in effect, I think in 22 states. The rest are subject to what was in place before that. EPA is saying right now implementation issues that arise are being handled on a case-by-case basis, but it's a legal mess, and it's going to get worse when this rule gets finalized. There'll be more litigation. So last topic, and this is really my only slide on this very complex topic of the DCP. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail other than I just wanted to demonstrate how complicated this issue is for our organization to try to stay on top of or develop principles or guiding principles. So when you look at Colorado River Basin, we have members in all 7 states. So way up top there is, well, to the right, that's the ag urban water purveyors on the Front Range. Northern is one of our members. On the other side of the mountain, you have Wyoming ranchers with individual water rights on the Colorado River tributaries, like Pat O'Toole. On the west slope, we have the big districts that have west slope concerns. And then as you go further south, we've got water users on the Yuma and water users who get Central Arizona project water, which are a totally different situation. And then we got Imperial Irrigation District as one of our members. So you can imagine trying to come up with some sort of consistent policy that makes everybody happy. I'm not sure we can do that. We did develop a white paper on Colorado River Principles in 2015 that I think many of you have seen. And it's just sort of a guideline to use in this sort of planning process. We're going to probably elevate that again. But at our upcoming annual conference in Reno, February 22nd in the morning, we're going to have 2 DCP panels, and the whole idea of this is to kind of demonstrate to our membership the complexity of this and how each one of our areas has to deal with unique issues. So we're going to have an Upper Basin panel. It's going to be moderated by Amy Haas from the Upper Colorado River Commission, and we'll have members, representatives from Northern, Southeast, Bruce Whitehead, Mark Harris, who's participated in some of the pilot project drought management programs, Pat O'Toole from Wyoming, and then our lower basin panel will be moderated by Dan Thielander, who's a board member from Arizona, and we're going to have ag and sort of professional representation there. So the whole idea is to really have an ag-centric perspective on DCP. I think it's going to be great, and if you can make our conference, that would be great. So I'm just about wrapped up here. Our conference is right there, 21st, 22nd. I'm losing a little bit of sleep because the government shuts down on February 15th. I may have to come up with Plan B for my agenda because we have a lot of reclamation folks and interior folks coming out. And that's my last slide, and I'll in all of this, with the DCP in particular and things that are going on in California, our number one priority is just trying to make sure that people understand the implications of just taking irrigated ag out of production. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here in the next series of discussions on the dais. We'll continue to do that. That's what our mission is all about. So I really thank you for this opportunity. And now I guess I'd like to just introduce Pat O'Toole, who's going to give a couple brief remarks before we get into our panel discussion. Pat and I came on board Family Farmland at the same time 14 years ago. He's been the president of the board. He was on the board before that. He was part of President Clinton's transition team. He's a former member of the Wyoming legislature. He sits on a lot of national boards, and he's got this incredible family operation. If you ever get a chance to get up to Ladder Ranch and see the things they're doing with livestock and the things they're doing for trout and the environment and sage grouse, it's amazing. And so we're really lucky to have Pat at the helm of the Family Farm Alliance. Please help me welcome him.
So my first observation is in Wyoming, this room would be a large town. Our family lives 15 miles from a town of 26, so we're not used to crowds. I just want to make a few remarks and throw out a few statistics that maybe will help stimulate the discussion. And you know, I also met Kate, your new Commissioner of Agriculture. She and her group did a case study on our water system and our ranch where we call it integrating our irrigation and fishery. And we've been so lucky in terms of our personal relationships with the federal system. Our river crosses the state line 30 times. We have ditches from Wyoming that irrigate Colorado lands. I'm a permittee in both Colorado and Wyoming Forest Service and BLM, so I know how to spell regulation. But at the same time, I've had some really great opportunities to meet with people who have wanted to, you know, sort of teach us how to work together. One of the bills that's just introduced yesterday is called the Wild Act from Senator Barrasso and bipartisan support, and it's about the Partners Program where people work together. It's the part of the Fish and Wildlife Service where we try to keep things from being listed. So our family does both Upper Colorado endangered fish and sage grouse, and is with a lot of help from good advisors, we've been very successful in that. When in California, because of the Delta smelt, which is one of the probably top 3 worst experiences of the Endangered Species Act, when Fish and Wildlife used to come in, it was all negative. When our guy comes into our valley, everybody goes, let's get some stuff done with Mark. And it's just a different way of looking at the world. In California, Region 8 was one of the most contentious endangered species areas in the country. Paul Souza, who will be at our conference, is the new Region 8 guy for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And you know what? People are working together to solve problems and figure out how to keep production agriculture and have species. So I just wanted to throw out a couple of statistics that I think are important. You know, and my theme was, you know, how do you keep ag profitable? It's really easy for me. Water and prices. If I have plenty of water and the prices are good, what a great life. The Yampa this year was called for the first time in history, and we never saw that kind of effect of drought in the recorded history in the Upper Colorado region. And prices are not doing very good. And I saw yesterday that there was no agreement with the president of China on some of the trade stuff, and we all hear about soybeans and corn. The reality that goes from almonds to sheep pelts, and things are happening. In part of our industry, we're looking at 27% tariffs from us, 0 from Australia and New Zealand going into China. Those are the kind of things we're going to have to deal with if we're going to have profitability in agriculture. So this weekend I spoke at and was able to sit at the American Farmland Trust meeting. Here's 2 statistics that just shocked me. One is we lose 175 acres an hour in this country transition away from agriculture. The other one is that 92% of farms and ranches in America are not prepared for a generational transition. In the next 15 years, we will have the largest land transfer in this country's history, and we are not prepared for it. And it's the kind of things that Kate's been working on. My son is the National Cattlemen's Organization Western Young Rancher guy. We've had some conference calls, national conference calls with young farmers and ranchers groups and a variety of commodity groups, because we all see it coming. And I just can't tell you how positive I think it is that the governor has appointed somebody who gets that and understands how important it is that we have to have another generation in agriculture. You know, I have more notes than I have time, but I wanted to mention one last thing. And I was in DC this week meeting with the various committees that deal with water infrastructure. And you know, it could be perceived that a split Congress could be really troublesome, but my perception, and that's meeting with, you know, Senate Republicans and House Democrats, that there is a vision of maybe there's some things we can work together. And the idea that the ESA could be looked at contiguous to the discussions we've had. The Western Governors process, I was at every single meeting except Hawaii. I couldn't talk my board into that. But we talked about a better America as it relates to wildlife and ranchers and farmers working together. And I think it's exciting to realize that we have a base. And in some conversations with the House Resource Committee Ds, it's clear the climate is going to be an issue that we're all going to have to deal with. When I talked about the Yampa last year, we had 2 rains in December and January at the Continental Divide that washed all the snow away. Early runoffs, all those things are things we're going to have to talk about. And so I just think there's an incredible opportunity to come together on the big issues of our time and figure out solutions that are long-term solutions for all of us. The last thing I'm going to mention, and I had a meeting with Jim Hubbard, who's a Colorado guy, head of forestry. In my world, they say 100,000 trees a day will fall on the Rocky Mountain area where all the pine beetle. We can no longer ride our horses into the forest. Hunters can't hunt, wildlife can't graze, and the watersheds are broken. We, as a response to DCP, the Farm Alliance is going to deal with 2 things. One is the reality that in the North Platte alone, we think 160,000 acre-feet of water is not going to be there for that system. And when you look at the entire forest system, understanding the relationship between healthy forests and water is absolute, and it's part of our future. And I believe Mr. Hubbard is committed to that. I see Brian Farabee from the Forest Service region here is here, and he's got the kind of leadership that we're going to figure out not only what we were given with the Farm Bill, but made an expansion of that. And it's an issue that is broad and across both the conservation community and the food producer community. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. You guys are problem solvers. That's the Family Farm Alliance. We're problem solvers. And we're looking forward to working with Colorado and irrigators and people on our board to solve some problems in the future. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks, Pat and Dan. Appreciate your remarks and appreciate all your good work that you're doing for Western Irrigators. Gives me pleasure now to introduce Secretary Tom Vilsack. As you all know, he was the United States Secretary of Agriculture from 2009 to 2017. He also served as the governor of the great state of Iowa, the breadbasket of the nation, right? And currently he's president and CEO of the Dairy Export Council, as well as he is acting as an advisor to Colorado State University on the National Western Project. Please welcome Secretary Vilsack.
Reagan, thank you very, very much. Hey, I'm an optimist. I think despite the challenges that you all have heard about today, of low prices in agriculture and trade uncertainty and labor shortages and science uncertainty and the challenges of climate, I think there's reason to be optimistic for the long term in agriculture in the United States. And I think it's important for everybody to understand how significant this industry is to the country. The food and agriculture industry employs, directly or indirectly, 43 million people. That's 28% of the entire American workforce. It represents and impacts 20% of our entire U.S. economy. And I think there is a growing recognition within agriculture, within the food industry, and within the country that agriculture and food are critically important for policymakers to pay attention to and to focus on. Mention has been made of the new Farm Bill. In addition to expanding opportunities with the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which really does promote collaboration and encourages large watershed scale projects, there was also an increased commitment to the Food and Agriculture Research Foundation, FAR, which will give us the opportunity to continue to focus on important research initiatives that will help expand opportunities in agriculture. I'm excited about that. I know that there's uncertainty about trade, but the reality is we've got a USMCA agreement We now have to convince our members of Congress and our friends in Congress to ratify that agreement so that we solidify our relationship in Mexico and Canada, two incredibly important markets. I know in the dairy industry we're going to see expanded opportunity with the passage and ratification of that agreement. There are ongoing discussions in China, and I think the good news is that Ambassador Lighthizer is engaged in those conversations. I think he is the deal maker in the Trump administration when it comes to trade, so the fact that he is traveling back to China in a couple of weeks suggests that there is real intent and focus on that March 1 deadline. Clearly the tariffs have hurt. Clearly they have impacted agricultural sales. I was pleased to see the Department of Agriculture, notwithstanding the shutdown, announce its export assistance program resources as part of the $12 billion commitment for the administration. We're now going to see additional resources provided to commodity groups. U.S. Dairy Export Council is going to receive almost $5.3 million to look at creative ways to expand beyond the Chinese market so that we have a true global opportunity in agriculture. And I think that those conversations and discussions at the end of the day have to reach some consensus. Both the U.S. and the Chinese economy have been impacted negatively by this trade dispute, and I think there's an intent on the part of leadership to get this thing resolved. I would just a simple word of caution that whatever we do with the Chinese, with all due respect to our friends in China, we got to make sure that there's strong enforcement mechanisms, because they have a tendency to agree to a lot of things, but it's the implementation that really matters. But I'm encouraged. I think there's going to be an opportunity here in the very near term to see a better situation with China. And I think that the administration is actively engaged in conversations with Japan is going to be helpful as well. We pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and I think the administration has a desire to engage in bilateral conversations. I think that's important. My hope is that they enter into an agreement with Japan fairly quickly. We recently did a study of the impact of pulling out of TPP. It created a void or a opportunity for the EU to enter into a free trade agreement. Clearly the beef and dairy industry and pork industry have been hurt by not having an agreement with Japan, so hopefully we'll see quick action in connection with that. On the labor side, I think the reality is the collective, we have to give our politicians the permission to resolve this immigration issue. I mean, the reality is that those folks on the left are very concerned about walls and barriers, and those folks on the extreme right are very concerned about amnesty. The reality is all of us know that we need more border security, and all of us know that it's unreasonable and unlikely to disinvite 12 million people who are currently in our country and have been here for a considerable period of time, that we're not going to deport all those people. The reality is, I think, because of the extreme right and left, politicians in D.C. are reluctant to enter into an agreed-upon comprehensive solution to immigration. We know what the solution is. We just have to give our politicians permission to get it done. And I think eventually that's going to happen, which would provide greater security and greater certainty for the agricultural community. You know, the water issue that you all are dealing with, this is an incredibly important meeting, obviously, and in a state that is, I think, taking the issue of water seriously. The water plan that Colorado's put together has identified what we have to do in the next 30 years. I'm excited about the partnership between CSU and Denver Water and others to create a water center as part of the National Western Center. There we're going to have a conversation about how we better educate the general public about the importance of water and their need to cooperate in developing ways to more efficiently and effectively use water. I'm excited about the research potential that this center can provide with the great auspices of the CSU, ways in which we can further precision agriculture, further a better understanding of how to use water effectively in agriculture. I would say that this should lead to innovation, which is also part of the center's responsibility, and the fact that we are looking at creating resources and a potential investment fund that would provide assistance and help to get some of these innovations into businesses and job creators here in Colorado and the West. I think the important role here is to also focus on the issue of regulation, and couldn't agree more with the previous speakers about the importance of speeding this process up. You know, candidly, our government structures and systems are not really designed for the 21st century. This is a century of incredibly rapid change. A rapid change in globalization, rapid change in the climate, rapid change in technology, and our systems are really designed for a much slower world. So I think it's going to be important for us as we focus on this center, this water center, to have a conversation and discussion about how we can accelerate policy formulation, how we can assist in streamlining the process. And I think the single most important thing is we need to give our government permission to make a mistake. The reality is, I think the reason we've got all these regulations is because people are afraid to make a mistake. They're afraid to be on the front page of the paper having made a mistake. I know this from my own experience as Secretary of Agriculture. I asked once how long it took for us to get a GMO trait approved. I was told it took 90 months, 90. I said I wanted to see the decision tree that required 90 months of activity. And what I got was a decision tree that is about as far from me past Reagan, almost to Pat. And I'm not kidding. This is seriously, this thing rolled out on an entire table. It was massive. I said, this is ridiculous. The reason we have this is because you all are afraid to make a mistake. The biggest mistake is not acting, not getting things done. So we streamline that process, and that needs to happen throughout our entire regulatory process. Let's give our folks permission to make a mistake so that we can get this process going more quickly as opposed to this delay that we have today. That's my view from experience. And Commissioner, this is something you're going to be dealing with at the state level, so you can look for an opportunity as you look for ways to encourage young people to get involved in farming. Streamlining the processes, making it easier is one solution. We're going to have a symposium that's focused on the convening power of the Water Center on March 14th here in Denver. We're looking forward to having a discussion about solutions that are already in play in Colorado and the West to preserve water. And I would hope that you all would look at the opportunity to attend that conference and to share with us what is working. I think we have to have a more positive, forward-thinking discussion. I think sometimes the tendency of folks in agriculture is to kind of look at the dark side of things. I think we need to have a more optimistic view. I'll close with this. I used to say to folks, you know, the marketing of agriculture to young people is interesting. This is what I hear in my state. I don't know if it happens here. First of all, farmers will tell you, in my state, they'll say, we really work hard. We're working all the time. We're overtaxed and overregulated. And that's the marketing to young people to get involved in agriculture. Good luck with that. I think it's better to focus on the entrepreneurial opportunities that agriculture and food present. I think it's better to talk about the connection between agriculture and community values. I think it's better to talk about the importance that people in farming and in the industry have. They're concerned about the land, about the need to give back, to contribute back. I think there are a lot of positive attributes that we need to focus on and emphasize in agriculture, and I think we have to have a more optimistic and positive message if we want young people to look at this as a possible career. And I think we have a lot of young people coming back and out of military service who came from rural communities, who want to go back to those rural communities. And so as you look at beginning farmer programs, these returning veterans are a tremendous source of opportunity. And frankly, a lot of these are coming back from war-torn combat zones. They want the nourishing aspect of agriculture to replenish their soul. So I think there's tremendous opportunity, and I look forward to working with folks here in Colorado and the West to deal with these water issues, because I think there's no more important calling today in a world that faces the challenge of feeding 9 billion people with more severe climate challenges than agriculture. It needs all of us working together. It needs all of us promoting agriculture. Now, Reagan, am I supposed to, you're going to do the commissioner because you want to do it right? You want to get in her good graces? I just want you to know this is a very important person with a very important job.
Thank you, Secretary Vilsack. Thanks very much, Secretary, and appreciate the optimism. It's always good to hear that. And so in that vein, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the the new Commissioner of Agriculture, Kate Greenberg. I think many of us who have worked on the Colorado River side have worked with Kate previously and have had gotten to know her and have had that privilege. You're all going to get to know her now in the next few years as she takes on the role of running the department and really being our spokesman for agriculture in the state of Colorado. So please, let's give Kate a good welcome up to the stage.
Well, good morning, everyone. Gosh, what an honor to be standing right here following this incredible lineup. An honor to follow Secretary Vilsack, to Dan and Pat and Reagan. We have worked together for years, and I'm excited for much more to come. So I see this as just a new beginning. So I know a lot of folks are interested in who I am. I've worked with a lot of you, and a lot of you I've yet to work with, and I'm very much looking forward to that. So much was said here before me that I hope I won't repeat. I took the title of this presentation, Keeping Agriculture Profitable, to heart, but I also wanted this to be a chance for you to get introduced to me and know a little bit more about who I am. I'm not from an agricultural family. I didn't grow up on a farm or ranch. I came to agriculture later in life. I was raised in the city with a lot of time spent out in corn country of southern Minnesota, so I'm one of those who kind of has a split world between the city and the country, and I think coming to agriculture later in life, I've seen that divide is real. I think it's something we all face between urban and rural communities, and it's something I'm committed to overcoming. It wasn't until I came west that I even realized there were people behind my food. I ate 3 meals a day and never considered that there were farmers and ranchers out on the ground making that food possible. I was a passive beneficiary. And I think when I realized that, that's when the trajectory of my life and my work really changed. So once I came west, I started to farm. I started working primarily on smaller scale operations, a lot of hand labor, figuring out what it means to move water with a shovel, which I don't always recommend, but sometimes has to happen. It's quite a lot of work. I moved to Mexico. I worked in the Colorado River Delta, again working on the land and understanding the role of interstate and international water policy from the end of the river system, and now I live at the headwaters, and so I'm seeing how it works top to bottom. I'm also, in that time, really seeing how our policies play out on the landscape, and of course, what the decisions that are made by policymakers implicate farmers and ranchers' lives, perhaps more than any. And I take that responsibility seriously to be an advocate. And finally, I made my way to Colorado. I live in Durango, although I currently don't really know where I live. But I call Durango home. And as Dan mentioned and Pat mentioned, for the last many years, I've been working with the National Young Farmers Coalition. I came to the coalition when we were a nascent organization. We were founded by young farmers who built a national, and we're building a national coalition as a platform for young people to have a voice in policy reform, a voice with their decision makers, and a network and a community out on the land. So in my time with young farmers, I loaded up my car and drove to as many farms and ranches across the West as I could. I met with producers around the kitchen table, organized farmer-led chapters. We took farmers to DC. We brought policymakers out to the farm. We worked on the last 2 farm bill cycles, and Dan covered that, which I'm glad he touched on. And really, my role there was to make sure that farmers always have a seat at the table where critical decisions are being made, and that those in positions of power understand the critical importance of agriculture to any decision they might make. Dan mentioned our collaboration in the past with Family Farm Alliance. The way that Pat and Dan have talked about their work has clearly been influential in the way I do mine. I've been the chair of the board for an organization called the Quivira Coalition for the last many years. Quivira was founded on a concept of the radical center. Regardless of what we disagree on, there's always something we do agree on, and we choose to focus our work there. And I'm committed to that ethos and approach in this work as commissioner as well. So in terms of the question of profitability, I don't want to go too far into it because I think, like everything, the question of profitability is inherently site and operation specific. Farming is a business, and farmers run their own businesses in their own ways. But at the same time, from my time working on the land and working on behalf of those of you who do work on the land, the question of profitability remains a real question, and Secretary Vilsack touched on many of those challenges. From my time with Young Farmers Coalition, much of the question of profitability started with affordability. The cost of land is pricing out young people who want to do this work. Producers who would like to keep their land in production have limited options as to how to do so and still pay for retirement, if retirement does even exist in agriculture. But the bottom line is that to even get in, it's unaffordable to farm for young people these days. And of course, right now, farmers are facing incredibly tough commodity prices, ongoing trade war that greatly impacts the bottom line. You know, farmers have to deal with the risk of a single hailstorm wiping out a crop, and that risk is coupled with extremely thin margins. But part of the reason I do this work and have committed my work and my life to advocating on behalf of farmers and ranchers is that I think producers are some of the most creative, innovative, risk-tolerant people that I know. Farmers are looking at new crops like hemp here in Colorado, as well as bringing back crops that have survived droughts for centuries. They're building enterprises that connect local, regional, and international markets. They're building co-ops, distribution companies, local slaughter facilities, looking at value-added, cultivating customers that care about soil health, ensuring the Colorado brand of agriculture reaps a premium. In the water universe, which I know is why we're all here today, I think farmers and ranchers are, of course, keenly focused on how we continue agriculture in the state of Colorado, given what we know about our water. This is where I think I really want to bring the message to this crowd, is how important agriculture is to any discussion on water. In thinking about the question of profitability, I was, of course, thinking about profitability as the financial yields that one gains in a business. But I think expanding the definition of profitability to include something that provides a benefit or a value, maybe including and beyond the financial value. And, you know, to most farmers and ranchers I know, measuring profitability doesn't end at the bottom line. It extends into how you feel at the end of the day or the season, when you've inevitably become exhausted, experienced heartache, and also know that the work you've done has meant something, both to you, your family, and to those who eat. So I bring this up for a reason. I think all of us here in the water community have big challenges, as we all know. In thinking about how we manage water, we must consider how it impacts not only the dollars and cents, but the value of the lives behind this work. I'm here because I see what we're losing. I see us losing farmland to development, water to drought, climate change and population growth. We're losing genetic diversity, losing sight of all the different ways to see the world, and all the different people who are and should be involved in agriculture. I think there's so much opportunity to see what we're losing as an opportunity for agriculture as well. The thing is that we have big problems with farmer mental health out in the country. Farmer suicide is a real issue in our agricultural communities. We're losing a generation of farmers and ranchers, and many are told that they should look for other work as farming is not actually profitable. But I'm hoping, as I mentioned, that this sense of loss can drive our work moving forward. I'm glad that Secretary Vilsack feels optimistic. That makes me feel optimistic. I think there's so many questions for us to ask and creative solutions for us to find together. How do we support succession, as Pat mentioned, between generations, help future generations get out on the land? How do we strengthen and diversify market opportunities so that ag remains among the top economic drivers in this state? How do we come together as a broad community to support producers in stewardship of soil, water, and climate? And how do we turn these challenges from profitability to water supply into opportunities? So I ask you, as leaders in the water world, please continue to see farmers and ranchers as your partners. Consider the lives behind the dollars and cents. When we lose people from the land and water from the land, we lose something we can never get back. So let's continue working together to get creative, understand one another, build networks that are strengthened by their diversity, and enjoy our meals knowing there are farmers and ranchers behind them. Thank you all so much. It's my pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome to your new role. It's great to have you here. So this probably should have been a 2-hour panel, and I have a whole page of questions, and we have just a few minutes left before the break, and that's the way it goes when you're moderating these things. I really appreciate all of your remarks, and what I'm thinking now is, since we only have really about a minute each to reflect, I'm watching the clock tick down here, is why don't we each, and maybe we'll start down with you, Dan, since we're talking to the Colorado Water Congress, we have many people here that are interested in the idea of keeping water on the land in Colorado. We have folks that work for the state government here. A lot of discussion about water plan. So what are your thoughts? And let's each of you just take a moment on what are the 2 or 3 things we can think about in terms of keeping ag profitable. How can the state invest resources? You can bring in infrastructure, new ideas about profitability. I know this is a big question, but this is going to be your wrap-up because you can see the clock ticking down. So Dan, what are your thoughts, and what message do you want to give to this crowd and folks working for the state?
Well, obviously you can see a lot of the work that we're focusing on is regulations. So trying to streamline the regulations to provide more certainty for operators is one thing. Looking at other possible cash flow streams, and to me, the whole idea of payment for environmental or ecosystem services is a field that we're starting to talk about, carbon credit trading and water quality trading and that sort of thing. We got an example in Oregon where the city of Medford had a temperature issue in Bear Creek, and they were spending millions and millions of dollars on these cooling towers to take care of the problem. A group came in called the Freshwater Trust, sat down with them and said, look, there's other ways that we can do this. They all agreed with EPA and the Department of Environmental Quality that they would agree on design standards. They basically said, okay, for every X acre of riparian habitat that we do, we're going to get Y degrees of temperature decrease in the creek. And they agreed upon that, and ultimately the city of Medford ended up paying these farmers to grow bundles of nature, as the Freshwater Trust calls it. And the farmers compensated. They had the skills to do this and to maintain the vegetation. The city of Medford saved millions of dollars, and the water quality standards were met. It's that kind of thinking, I think, that we got to apply and use farmers and their skills and find ways to compensate them for public benefits that we're all enjoying.
Good point. Thank you, Dan. Good point. Pat?
Yeah, one of the things that's going to be rolled out at the Family Farm Alliance meeting in 3 weeks is what we call Water For. I went to Alamosa with a group working on migratory birds. There are no potentially listed migratory birds in America because of the work that farmers and ranchers have done putting water on the land. If we are to lose that capability or change that capability because of water transfers, for example, here's the 3 major things that happen. When you flood irrigate, 1, you have the habitat. 2, recharging of aquifers. And we're learning more and more how important that recharge is going to be. And the 3rd one is the crop for the farmer and rancher. And I think understanding how interconnected we are, my friend Don Schwint, has been so good at talking about the unappreciated and unfinanced benefits for the environment from agriculture, and we think that's part of our future.
Good. Secretary Vilsack.
I think we need to think differently, and I think we need to look at a new model when it comes to agriculture and the environment. I think the ecosystem market is a really good idea. Land-grant universities have to help us understand how to measure, quantify, and verify conservation results so they can be marketed. I think the Sage Grouse Initiative in the West is a very good model for how we ought to approach this in the future. Rather than focusing on regulation, I think if you can combine incentives with certainty, you will actually have greater progress in terms of water conservation and preservation. I think our mentality has always been to regulate first. I think we need to incent and provide certainty. And then the last thing I would say is I think we all have a real responsibility to educate ordinary folks out there who are not farmers, who are not ranchers, about the important role that we all have in terms of preserving water. I think we think about air a lot. I think we think about soil conservation a lot, but I don't think we think as much about water. And I think more and more, especially in the West, water is going to become critically important. We've got to prepare people for changes of the way they do business and how they think about water.
Thank you. Commissioner Greenberg, you get the last word.
All right, thank you. I think sort of the capstone there is I see agriculture at the forefront of all of this work, and with the water plan, I think it's an immense opportunity for agriculture, for farmers and ranchers to step out ahead, to show how agriculture is at the forefront of this work, how we're going to take it into the future in a way that's led and driven by farmers and ranchers. So that's my pitch, that this is a window of opportunity for agriculture to really step out in front.
Thank you all. You've been a great panel. Would you all please give them another hand? So our time was short, but we ended up right on time for the break. Maybe they'll stay around for a few minutes and you guys can come up and dialogue more with them. So break time. Thank you all.